Paris?
You got it. I mean, a lot of the people that we're seeing, many of the governors, in fact, are actually Republican presidential candidates. So there's a strong tinge of political posturing going on here, and we'll see what it actually ends up being. But I think so far, much of the reaction has been largely partisan, though not all of it. And as long as this remains a federal issue, I think President Obama, who is a Democrat, is unlikely to change course. He's made it very clear that he believes the United States should continue to play a role in this process and chip in to the global effort to resettle these refugees.
But what the Republican governors are pushing for, is that reflective of how Americans generally have reacted to the Paris events?
I think it's reflective of the partisan split in the country at large. I think Republicans in general are very cautious about immigration, and they're even more cautious about refugees who are coming from parts of the Middle East where they believe there's a risk of terrorists or extremists slipping through the cracks. So that's more of a partisan concern than it is a groundswell of concern in the country. I think that the fact that you see many Democrats not really joining in on this is a signal that they don't necessarily believe that their constituents want them to respond in this way.
And as an outside observer, one could argue that it's already very difficult to get into the United States.
It is, but we also have a growing political groundswell to deal with the immigration on our southern border with Mexico, and that's a huge political issue in this campaign, not even considering what's going on in the Middle East. And so I think we'll continue to see this being a problem going forward.
Abby Phillip, thank you very much for explaining that to us.
Thanks for having me.
And Abby Phillip is a political reporter at the Washington Post newspaper. Let's go across the Atlantic to the UK, where they've announced they're going to employ nearly 2,000 more security and intelligence officers as they step up their counter-terrorism efforts following the Paris attacks. It's aiding France with extra border checks of people and goods travelling between the two nations. But while France has responded to the attacks by ramping up airstrikes on Islamic State targets in Syria, the British government is still trying to secure enough support in the National Parliament to expand its military involvement beyond Iraq. This report from Melissa Clark in London.
Around London, there are more uniformed police on foot patrols at popular tourist sites and public institutions. Private security guards stand at the doorsteps of buildings that, just days ago, pedestrians were able to come and go from. The UK Home Secretary, Theresa May, says it's part of a concerted effort to step up security following the Paris attacks.
The police have increased their presence on some streets and at some locations, and they will be intensifying their approach at events in big cities.
That includes a soccer friendly between France and England, which will go ahead Tuesday night, local time, despite the security concerns. They're very real concerns. 7 terrorist plots have been foiled by British police and security services in the last 6 months. UK Prime Minister David Cameron has described the threat of terrorism as the struggle of this generation.
We will do everything we can to make sure we keep our people safe, but we live in a very, very dangerous world.
That includes giving security agencies more funding so they can employ nearly 2,000 extra security and intelligence officers. But it doesn't include taking the sort of action France has, bombing Islamic State targets in Syria. David Cameron lost a vote in Parliament to approve expanding British airstrikes from Iraq to Syria in 2013.
The noes to the left, 285.
He says Islamic State doesn't recognise the border, so neither should those fighting them. But he's reluctant to call on another vote unless its success is guaranteed.
I need to build the argument. I need to take it to Parliament. I need to convince more people. We won't hold that vote unless we can see that Parliament would endorse that action, because to fail on this would be damaging. It's not a question of damaging the government. It's a question of not damaging our country and its reputation in the world. So I will build the case, but in the end Parliament must decide.
But with Labour's Jeremy Corbyn, a long-time anti-war campaigner leading the opposition, he's unlikely to get his wish.
The issue of the bombing of Syria does not seem to me to be the right way forward on this, and so I do not support it at this stage.
But on the former UK Defence Secretary Liam Fox says David Cameron should bypass Parliament and order the military to conduct the airstrikes anyway.
Well, I've always argued, including in the Commons, that if it's necessary for our national security, the government should act and then explain it to Parliament. But we seem to have developed this convention really since the Iraq war that Parliament needs to be consulted before we take military action. I don't believe that's constitutionally correct. I don't think it's necessary, but it seems to be the convention that we have adopted.
But convention dictates much of British politics, so for now, Britain's military actions will remain constrained.
That's Melissa Clark in London, and memorials were held across Australia last night in honour of the victims of the Paris attacks. In Sydney, a special mass was held at St Mary's Catholic Cathedral. It was attended by the New South Wales Premier Mike Baird, as well as representatives of the French and Muslim communities. Michael Edwards was there.
Hundreds of people packed out St Mary's Cathedral to pay their respects. Among them, the New South Wales Governor David Hurley and politicians from across the major parties, including the Premier Mike Baird.
Neither death nor life, no angel, no prince, nothing that exists, nothing still to come, not any power or height or depth, nor any created thing can ever come between us and the love of God.
Prayers were read out in French. In his sermon, Sydney's Archbishop Anthony Fisher described the need for people of all faiths to band together to defeat evil.
This was an attack on innocent human beings. It was an assault also on humanity, on every aspect of human flourishing, human life and health, family and friendship, freedom and security.
Representatives from other religions also attended the Mass. Muslim community leader Maha Abdo lit a candle in solidarity with the victims of the attack.
I come with a heavy heart, but hopefully with the hope that my being here is not just a symbolic one.
That report prepared for us by Michael Edwards in Sydney, and in Melbourne many gathered at the Federation Square.
Hundreds of people were at the vigil, many carrying French flags or wearing T-shirts bearing the Peace for Paris sign. Frenchwoman Tiffane wishes she were at home with family and friends, but she took strength from the crowd in Melbourne.
It's like one way of kind of like being home, feeling home, and it's really nice that there is people from other countries coming as well to support us, and it has the heart.
Melburnian Melinda Howard has lived in Paris's 10th district, where some of the attacks took place.
And because it's the area that I lived in and I knew so well, and in fact the restaurant that I went to and things like that, it's just like a whole part of my life has been blown apart.
Frenchwoman Audrey has lived in Australia for 9 years.
We feel so far from home, but we're just so touched as well. So it's so important, and to sing the anthem all together, feels very, very good.
Rachid Chenchebi is a Tunisian Frenchman now living here. He fears the attacks will threaten France's multiculturalism.
And I was really, really worried about living there. You can imagine that. This work is really preparing the door for fascism.
Do you think Muslim people and others from different faiths, different nationalities will have a harder time now in France?
That's what I think, a really hard time.
That's Rachid Chenchebi ending Samantha Donovan's report. It's time now to check the traffic flow with Paul Latta from the Australian Traffic Network.
And thanks for starting with Everton Park in Brisbane, Old Northern Road, Citybound, right lane, Rogers Parade, 3-car crash. A pedestrian struck at Capera, Dawson Parade, Blaker Street outside the train station, so please be careful there. And also at Narangba, Mumford Road, Mackie Road, still a crash for you. Gold Coast, that's okay right now, nothing major standing out. Sydney though, we've got a broken down truck at St Peters which is causing untold chaos. He was on Canal Road westbound, he tried to turn left to go onto the highway and he vehicle, and he broke down right there and then. So southbound totally blocked on the highway, westbound totally blocked on our road, northbound can't do the right turn, so as you can imagine, it is absolutely chaotic. Southern Cross Drive is still a very slow Botany Road to Eastern Distributor Run as well. We look down towards Canberra, that's okay, into Melbourne. We've got firstly a crash at South Bank, Moray Street, City Road, so to Port Melbourne, Lorimer Street, Todd Road. Still a Camberwell crash on Camberwell Road, Arlington Street, and again a Killside camp. Been there a while, Canterbury Road and Liverpool Road. Hobart's looking great this morning. Don't forget, they're doing some vegetation clearing on Mount Wellington, so if you're going up Pinnacle Road and down again, stop slow in place for certain sections, and this is happening until the 4th of December, so it's going to take quite a while. I look across towards Adelaide, a bit of residual peak hour traffic, but I've got absolutely no incidents. And looking towards Perth, peak hours just starting to commence really, and I've got no problems. Lots of traffic, but it's seemingly evenly spaced apart. I'm Paul Latter. More ABC News Radio traffic in half an hour.
Thank you, Paul. Speak to you then. Eastern Daylight Time is 10 o'clock this Tuesday, the 17th of November. It's 9:30 in South Australia, 9 o'clock in Queensland, 8:30 in the Northern Territory, and 7 o'clock in Western Australia.
ABC News Radio.
The French President Francois Hollande has called for a coalition between France, the US and Russia to destroy Islamic State. He told a special parliamentary session the state of emergency imposed during the Paris attacks could be extended for 3 months. Belgian police have also carried out a raid in Brussels as they hunt for a man believed to have been involved in the Paris attacks. And in Paris itself, police carried out 168 raids overnight, seizing weapons and arresting dozens of people. More from Al Jazeera's Niamh Barker in the French capital.
In the Grand Congress Room of the Palace of Versailles, members of both the upper and lower houses of Parliament stood to sing the national anthem. Addressing lawmakers, President Francois Hollande called on the country to unite during one of France's darkest hours. Hollande also called for a change to the constitution, giving the government extra powers to prevent further attacks. The current state of emergency will now be extended for 3 months. Paris is a changed city, scarred by violence, but united in grief. A minute's silence to reflect on the worst attacks since the Second World War. Overnight, French police staged 168 raids in several major cities across the country. In the last 2 days, more than 100 people have been placed under house arrest.
The Defence Minister Maurice Payne says it would be irresponsible not to take into account recent attacks in Paris when considering Australia's military role in the Middle East. Last month, the French Navy requested an Australian frigate join its warship in the Persian Gulf. In the wake of the Paris attacks, France has stepped up its bombing campaign against Islamic State in Raqqa. Senator Payne says the Paris terrorist attacks will be part of the government's consideration of the request.
It must factor into our thinking, absolutely, no question about that. It must factor into our thinking because obviously the flow-on effects can be and I suspect will be considerable.
US President Barack Obama has called on other nations to contribute more humanitarian aid for Syria and reassured his citizens that any refugees will only enter the US after rigorous screening. Speaking at the G20 summit in Turkey, he says that the military is continuing to accelerate actions in Syria as it finds additional partners on the ground. He says calls to send large amounts of troops into the country are a mistake.
We would see a repetition of what we've seen before, which is if you do not have local populations that are committed to inclusive governance and who are pushing back against ideological extremes, they resurface unless we're prepared to have a permanent occupation of these countries.
The Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull and Barack Obama will have their first official bilateral meeting when they arrive in Manila later today. Correspondent Samantha Hawley reports from the Philippines capital.
As with the G20 in Turkey, APEC in Manila will be dominated by discussion of the attacks in Paris, Syria and the fight against Islamic State. Mr Turnbull will have his first opportunity as Prime Minister for a one-on-one bilateral meeting with the US President Barack Obama. The pair also met briefly on the sidelines of the G20 in Turkey. Although it won't be on the official agenda, at China's urging, frictions over the South China Sea will also be discussed, along with the Trans-Pacific Partnership deal. Samantha Hawley, ABC News, Manila.
A summit on countering the financing of terrorism networks has just started in Sydney. Experts from across the Asia-Pacific have gathered for the meeting, which is being hosted by Australia's Financial Intelligence Agency. In the last 2 weeks, 4 major attacks have been linked to Islamic State, including the weekend attacks in France and the downing of the Russian jetliner over Egypt. Giving the opening address, the Minister for Justice and Counter-Terrorism, Michael Keenan, said that the world is united in the threat it faces from IS.
Everyone here today shares a common purpose: to protect the beliefs and values that we hold dear from those that seek to change them through intimidation and violence. It is more important than ever that we as an international community work together to disrupt, degrade and ultimately destroy this barbaric terrorist organisation and its toxic ideology.
New South Wales police are rethinking their response to terrorist incidents by training officers to shoot armed extremists on site. The Acting Police Commissioner Nick Caldis has confirmed a new armed offender training course based on FBI tactics began 3 weeks ago. He says it represents a move away from the force's traditional approach to hostage situations of contain and negotiate, which has been in place for 2 decades. Mr Caldis this morning told Sydney commercial radio station TUE that police have to change the way they respond to terrorist attacks.
And that is simply by saying there may be occasions, and I stress may be occasions, where the police will need to move forward rather than simply try and contain a place and try and negotiate with people who, certainly as can be seen in France, will not negotiate.
The Federal Treasury